The vending machine in the lobby of Mercy General Hospital had been broken for 11 days. Not broken in the way that meant it wouldn't accept money. Broken in the way that was somehow worse. It accepted every dollar you fed into it, made all the appropriate sounds of mechanical consideration, and then delivered nothing. The maintenance crew had taped a small handwritten note to the front that said out of order, but the tape had peeled on one corner, and the note curled inward on itself like something embarrassed, and most people simply didn't see it until after they had already lost their money. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. 9-year-old Caleb Monroe had been sitting in the hospital lobby for 4 hours when he noticed a sign. He had been sitting in the same orange plastic chair since 2 in the afternoon, the kind of chair that is shaped in a way that seems to suggest comfort but delivers none. With his backpack between his feet and his hands folded in his lap, the way his grandmother had taught him to sit when he was in a place where adults were worried and noise was unkind. He had a homework worksheet in his backpack that he was supposed to have finished 2 days ago. He had not finished it. He had not been able to think about fractions for 2 days, because 2 days ago his grandmother had collapsed in their kitchen while she was making oatmeal, and she had been in this hospital ever since, and no one had told him anything that made sense. His name was Caleb Elias Monroe. He was 9 years old and small for his age, with dark brown skin and close-cropped hair and eyes that were large and serious in a particular way of children who had learned early that the world requires careful watching. He was wearing a blue sweatshirt with a small bleach stain on the left cuff that his grandmother had tried to dye over with fabric marker and had not quite succeeded with, and sneakers that were one size too big because his grandmother had bought them that way on purpose, so he wouldn't grow out of them too fast. His grandmother's name was Dorothea Monroe. Everyone who knew her called her Miss. Miss was 68 years old and had raised Caleb since he was 14 months old, when his mother, her youngest daughter Priscilla, had left him with her one Tuesday morning and had not come back. Not because she was cruel. Miss had always been careful to explain to Caleb, but because she was sick in a way that made it impossible for her to take care of anyone, including herself. Priscilla was somewhere. They got a postcard from Chicago when Caleb was 4. There had been nothing since. Caleb's father was a name on a birth certificate that nobody had been able to locate. Miss had raised Caleb on a fixed income in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a building on Clement Street, in a city that had gotten significantly more expensive in the 9 years since Caleb was born. She worked 3 days a week at a dry cleaning shop 2 blocks away, pressing shirts and steaming coat collars for $7.50 an hour, and she received a small Social Security check on the 14th of every month that covered exactly the rent and nothing else if she was careful, and less than the rent if she wasn't. She had never once let Caleb go to school without breakfast. She had never once sent him to bed without checking his homework. She had read to him every night until he was 7, and after he was 7, he read to her, and she listened with the full attention of someone who understood that being read to by your grandchild was one of the specific privileges of a life well spent. She had been the only constant thing in Caleb's world for as long as he had been in the world, and now she was somewhere on the 3rd floor of this hospital in a room he had not been allowed to visit, and a nurse named Gwen had brought him downstairs at 2 o'clock and told him to wait, and had promised to come back in an hour with news, and that had been 4 hours ago, and Gwen had not come back. Caleb was not crying. He had cried in the ambulance. He had cried in the emergency waiting room when the admitting nurse had asked him who his emergency contact was, and he had not known what to say because Miss was his emergency contact, and Miss was the emergency. He had cried until he had nothing left, and now he was sitting in the orange plastic chair with his hands folded, watching the lobby, waiting. The lobby of Mercy General Hospital at 6 in the evening was a particular kind of human theater. There were people arriving with the brisk, purposeful energy of those who had just gotten off work and driven directly here. There were people leaving with the soft, hollowed-out look of those who had been here too long. There were children younger than Caleb asleep across their parents' laps, and elderly people moving in the careful, measured way of those for whom every floor is potentially treacherous, and a man in the corner who appeared to have been crying for some time and was now past crying and had arrived at the still, flat place that comes after. Caleb watched all of it without really seeing it. His stomach made a sound that embarrassed him, even though no one was close enough to hear. He had not eaten since breakfast, which had been the last of the oatmeal made by Miss before she fell. The thought of that oatmeal, half finished in the bowl on the counter of their apartment, still sitting there because everything had happened too fast for anyone to put away, made his throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. He looked at the vending machine. He had $3.25 in the front pocket of his backpack. It was money Miss had given him on Monday for the school book fair that he had not gone to because a collapse had happened Monday morning before school. He had been holding on to it carefully, the way Miss had taught him to hold on to money, which was with the specific awareness that it was limited and replaceable only with effort. He walked to the vending machine. He read the sign. He stood there for a moment looking at it, then looked at the machine, then at the sign again. He turned around. There was a woman sitting 4 chairs down from where he had been sitting. He had noticed her when he first came down because she was the kind of person you noticed, not because she was particularly remarkable in appearance, but because she was remarkably still. She was perhaps 60 years old, or perhaps older. It was hard to tell, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, and a coat that had seen significant use. She was reading a paperback book that was so worn the spine had given up entirely, and the pages fanned out like a small accordion. She had a paper cup of coffee on the seat beside her that was clearly long cold. She had been in that chair, Caleb realized, for as long as he had been watching, maybe longer. He walked back to his chair and sat down. His stomach made the sound again. The woman with the paperback looked up over her glasses. She looked at him, then at the vending machine, then back at him. "The sign is true," she said. Her voice was low and a little scratchy, the voice of someone who didn't use it often and didn't mind. "It took my $1 Monday and my $1 Tuesday. I stopped arguing with it." Caleb nodded. "I saw the sign," he said. "Smart." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been here a while." "Since 2. She looked at the clock on the wall across the lobby. It was 14 minutes past 6. That's a long while for someone your age to be sitting alone. "I'm waiting for news about my grandmother," Caleb said. He said it the way he had been practicing saying it in his head, evenly, without the crack in the middle of it that happened when he said it to himself. The woman looked at him with an expression that was not pity. He had gotten enough pity looks today that he had learned to recognize the shape of them, but something more considered, something that looked like recognition. "I'm waiting for news about my husband," she said. "He went in this morning. They keep telling me soon." Caleb nodded. He understood soon. They sat in silence for a moment that was not particularly uncomfortable. "There's a cafeteria," the woman said, "down that hall left at the end. It's not good, but it's food. They have soup." "Thank you," Caleb said. He didn't move. The woman watched him for a moment. Then she set down her book, reached into the bag beside her chair, and took out a small paper bag. She opened it and looked inside. "I have crackers," she said, "and there appears to be half a peanut butter sandwich that I didn't finish at noon." She held the bag out toward him. Caleb looked at the bag. He looked at her. He had been taught very specifically about accepting food from strangers. He had also been taught very specifically about the kind of kindness that was offered without performance, without expectation, without the particular warmth that people put into an act when they want you to know they are being kind. This woman was offering the bag the way you offer something that is simply available, matter-of-factly, without making him feel small for needing it. Mist would have approved of her, he decided. "Thank you," he said, and took the bag. The peanut butter sandwich was slightly stale and tasted better than anything he could remember eating. The woman went back to her book. Caleb ate carefully, not rushing, watching the lobby. After a few minutes, she spoke without looking up. "What's your grandmother's name?" "Dorothea Monroe," Caleb said, "but people call her Mr. "Miss Dot," the woman repeated, as if she were remembering it specifically. "That's a good name. My husband's name is Gerald. People call him Jerry, but he hates it. He's been telling people to stop for 40 years. Nobody stops. Caleb almost smiled. My name is Caleb, he said. Frances, the woman said. Frances Eliot. They shook hands, which felt slightly formal given the circumstances, but also felt right in a way that formal things sometimes feel right when the situation is serious. Frances Eliot went back to her book. Caleb finished the sandwich and folded the paper bag carefully and put it in his backpack's outer pocket, because Miss had taught him that littering was a form of disrespect toward the people who clean public places, and that those people work hard enough without having to pick up after people who couldn't be bothered. At 7:15, a doctor came through the lobby doors and walked directly to Frances Eliot. Caleb watched the conversation happen. He watched Frances's face do something complicated. He watched her close her book and stand up and follow the doctor back through the doors. As she passed his chair, she paused and looked at him. I hope Miss gets better very soon, she said quietly. I hope your husband is okay, Caleb said. She nodded once, and then she was gone, and Caleb was alone in his row of orange chairs again, and the lobby seemed slightly emptier than it had before. At 8:45, Nurse Gwen appeared, and her expression was the expression of someone who had meant to come back 6 hours ago and felt terrible about it, and who was also carrying news that had its own complicated shape. Caleb, she said, sitting down in the chair Frances Eliot had vacated. I'm so sorry it took so long. Let me tell you what we know. What they knew was this. Miss had had a stroke. It was not, the doctors were being careful to say, the worst kind. She was stable. She was awake. She had asked for Caleb 3 times. But she was going to need care, significant, ongoing care, and the road ahead was going to be difficult, and there were going to be people who needed to make decisions, and those people were going to need to be adults, and Caleb was 9 years old, and the hospital needed to know if there was anyone else. There was no one else. This was a fact that Nurse Gwen was carefully, gently trying to navigate around, but which Caleb already knew in the specific way, you know, a thing when it's been the shape of your whole life. There was no one else. There had never been anyone else. There was Miss Dot and there was Caleb, and between them they were enough. And now Miss Dot was in a hospital bed asking for him, and Caleb was 9 years old, and there was no one else. Can I see her? Caleb asked. Yes, Gwen said. I'll take you up right now. Miss Dot's room was on the 3rd floor and smelled like the specific smell of hospital rooms, which is a smell of cleanliness and anxiety combined. She was in the bed nearest the window, which had a view of the hospital parking lot, which was not a beautiful view, but was at least evidence of the outside world continuing to exist. She was smaller than Caleb had ever seen her. There were tubes and monitors and the quiet machinery of care surrounding her, but her eyes, when they found him in the doorway, were her eyes, the same eyes that checked his homework and read him to sleep and watched him from the kitchen window when he played in the courtyard below. Baby, she said. Her voice was slow and slightly slurred on one side, which Nurse Gwen had warned him about. Come here. He crossed the room in 6 steps. He took her hand, which was dry and warm and familiar, and he held it with both of his because both of his together were still smaller than hers, and he stood beside the bed and did not cry because he had promised himself in the elevator that he would not cry in front of her because she had enough to manage. I'm here, Grandma, he said. I've been here all day. I know, she said. Gwen told me. Her eyes moved over him, checking the way they always checked. You eat? Yes, ma'am. What did you eat? A peanut butter sandwich, he said, and crackers. A lady in the lobby gave them to me. Miss Dot's eyes sharpened slightly. What lady? Her name was Frances. Her husband was sick too. She was reading a book. Miss was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the particular certainty of someone who has spent 68 years taking the measure of people by their actions, she sounds like a good woman. She was, Caleb said, she was. What happened next happened with the specific swift efficiency of systems that have been designed not for people inside them, but for the convenience of the people who administrate them. The hospital social services department was notified that a 9-year-old boy had been identified as having no available guardian other than the hospitalized woman. A social worker named Mr. Dennis Farrow arrived at 9:30 in the evening, carrying a clipboard in a manner that was professionally sympathetic in a way that felt practiced. He sat across from Caleb in a small consultation room and asked questions that Caleb answered carefully, because Miss had taught him to be careful with people who wrote things on clipboards. Was there a father? No, sir. A mother? She lives somewhere, but I don't have a way to reach her. Other family? No, sir. Family friends who could provide temporary care? Caleb thought about this one. Mrs. Kim from the dry cleaning shop sometimes brought food when Miss Dot was tired. The Reverend Whitaker from their church knew their name and shook Caleb's hand every Sunday. But none of them were the kind of people to whom you could hand a 9-year-old child for an indefinite period. And Caleb understood this, even if he didn't have the words for it. Mr. Farrow made notes. He explained in the gentle but efficient language of a man who had done this many times that temporary foster placement would need to be arranged, that this was a normal procedure for situations like Caleb's, that it didn't mean anything permanent, that Miss Dot would be informed and would be part of any decisions made. Caleb listened. He nodded at the appropriate intervals. He asked 2 questions. When can I see my grandmother again? Can I bring my homework? Mr. Farrow said yes to both, and Caleb believed him on the homework and reserved judgment on the first one. The Foster family's name was Granger. They lived in a suburb 40 minutes from the hospital, which felt like a significant distance to a boy who had never lived more than 3 blocks from anyone he knew. There was a husband and a wife and 2 children of their own, both teenagers who occupied their own world with the self-contained remoteness of teenagers who had been asked to share their home with a series of other people's children and had developed a polite but practiced indifference to the process. The Grangers were not unkind. That was important to understand. They were not cruel or neglectful or any of the things that the word foster, in its worst form, could mean. They fed Caleb properly. They gave him a clean bedroom. Mrs. Granger washed his school clothes. Mr. Granger drove him to school every morning without complaint. They were doing what they had agreed to do, and they were doing it adequately. But they were not Miss Dot. Caleb went to school. He did his homework at the kitchen table. He ate dinner with the Grangers and answered questions about his day in a measured, even way that he answered all questions now, offering the minimum required and keeping the rest of himself somewhere interior and protected where nothing could reach it. Every Wednesday afternoon, Mr. Farrow drove him to the hospital to see Miss Dot. The visits were 45 minutes, which was the allotted time, and in those 45 minutes Caleb existed in a completely different way than he existed in every other moment of the week. He talked. He told her everything. The homework, the teachers, the cafeteria food, the teenagers in the Granger house, who sometimes talked to him and sometimes looked through him as if he were furniture. Miss Dot listened with the focus entirety of her attention, the way she had always listened, and she asked questions, and she laughed at the right moments, and she held his hand. And for 45 minutes the hospital room was something close to home. She was improving, slowly but genuinely. The slurring in her speech was clearing. She was doing the physical therapy exercises with the committed effort of a woman who understood that her body was the only vehicle she had, and that it required maintenance. She asked about her apartment, her dry cleaning shifts, her plants on the windowsill. She asked about money with the specific contained worry of a person who knows the shape of financial precarity intimately. There was a problem with the money. Miss Dot's Social Security check had continued to arrive, as it would, but without her dry cleaning income, and with the hospital bills beginning to accumulate, and with the specific costs of ongoing rehabilitation and medication, the arithmetic was developing a gap that widened every week. Caleb didn't know the full extent of it, but he understood enough, from the way Miss Dot's expression changed when the subject came up and then resolved itself into careful neutrality, to know that the arithmetic was serious. He did not ask about returning home. He understood that returning home was dependent on Miss Dot's recovery reaching a certain threshold, and that until that threshold was reached, he would stay with the Grangers, and he would visit on Wednesdays. and he would do his homework and eat his dinner and perform the function of a boy who was managing adequately. On the inside, he was doing something else entirely. He was watching. He had been watching since the lobby of the hospital, since the broken vending machine and Frances Eliot and her peanut butter sandwich. He had been watching in the particular way his grandmother had taught him to watch, which was not with suspicion but with attention, because the world, she had told him many times, was full of information that it would give you freely if you were quiet enough to receive it. He watched Mr. Farrow. He watched how Mr. Farrow talked about Miss Dott's case with the specific shorthand of a man for whom it was one case among many. The way the file was a manageable thickness, and not a person's entire life compressed into paper. He watched the hospital bills that came to the Granger house, forwarded from Miss Dott's apartment, which he was not supposed to see, but which he saw because he was 9 and quiet, and adults left things on tables when they forgot he was in the room. He watched the rehabilitation center where Miss Dott had been transferred after 3 weeks, a facility called Sunrise Care, which was clean and adequately staffed and which had, Caleb noticed during visits, a significant number of residents who appear to have received no visitors in some time. He noticed a particular expression on those residents' faces, the expression Frances Eliot had not had, which told him something important about what the absence of visitors did to a person over time. And he did what he had always done when he noticed things that seemed important. He told Miss Dott, "There's a man on the 2nd floor," he said one Wednesday. "His name is Mr. Arthur. He sits by the window every time I walk past. He never has anyone with him." Miss Dott considered this. "Did you speak to him?" "I waved," Caleb said. He waved back. He seemed surprised. People who are forgotten are always surprised when someone sees them, Miss said. Her voice had almost entirely recovered its normal shape now. She sounded like herself again, which was the best sound Caleb knew. "What are you going to do about it?" "I was thinking," Caleb said carefully, "that I get here at 2 and I'm not allowed in your room until 2:30 because of the physical therapy schedule. So I have 30 minutes. Miss Dott looked at him. "You're going to visit this Mr. Arthur. I thought I might, if that's okay." Miss was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Baby, that is more than okay. That is exactly right." The following Wednesday, Caleb stopped at the nurse's station on the 2nd floor and asked if it would be all right to visit with Mr. Arthur Simmons for a few minutes, because he had noticed he didn't seem to have visitors and he thought he might be lonely. The nurse on duty, a young woman named Tanisha who had a daughter Caleb's age and who was not prepared for a 9-year-old boy in a too big blue sweatshirt to ask her this with complete seriousness, told him that yes, it would be more than all right, and that Mr. Arthur would probably be very glad to see him. Mr. Arthur Simmons was 74 years old. He had been a bus driver for 31 years. He had a daughter in Phoenix who called on birthdays, as she remembered, and a son in the same city who had meant come last month and had not made it, and a collection of model trains that were in a box somewhere in his son's garage because there had been no room for them here. His room had a window that looked out on a garden that nobody maintained anymore. He had been in Sunrise Care for 7 months. The first day, Caleb sat in a chair beside the window, and Mr. Arthur talked about buses. Specifically, the differences between the various bus models he had driven over 3 decades, which lines had the longest routes, which routes took you past the best parts of the city. Caleb listened with genuine attention, because he found that interesting. He had ridden buses his whole life without knowing any of this, and knowing it made him feel like he understood his own city slightly better. When he stood up to leave, Mr. Arthur said, "You coming back next week?" "Yes, sir," Caleb said, "every Wednesday." Mr. Arthur nodded, and something in his face shifted in a way that Caleb would not be able to describe precisely, but which he recognized, because he had felt it himself in the hospital lobby when Frances Eliot had offered him the paper bag. The feeling of someone seeing you before they knew what you had, or didn't have. The feeling of being worth something simply because you existed. October turned to November, turned to December that was cold and specific in the way that December in the city is cold. Not the soft cold of open country, but the hard cold that bounces off concrete and finds a gap between your collar and your scarf. Caleb had been living with the Grangers for 4 months. Miss Dutt was making progress. The physical therapist at Sunrise Care called it remarkable. The speed of her recovery, which was a kind of word that medical professionals use when a patient was doing something their initial prognosis had not fully anticipated. Miss, who had spent 68 years in a body she had maintained with the frugal care of a woman who understood it was the only one she had, was applying to her rehabilitation the same committed determination she had applied to everything in her life. She was walking with a cane now. Her speech was fully clear. Her mind had lost none of its precision. The problem was the money. The hospital bills had arrived in full. The rehabilitation facility had a daily rate. Miss Dott's Social Security check, her only income while she remained at Sunrise Care, was covering less than a third of it. The dry cleaning shop had given her position to someone else out of necessity after she had been unable to return to work. The apartment rent continued without her in it. There was a number, Caleb had come to understand, that stood between Miss Dot coming home and Miss Dot staying in Sunrise Care indefinitely, and that number was growing, and Miss Dot's face when the subject came up had developed a particular quality of controlled fear that Caleb had never seen on her face before, and that was more frightening to him than anything else that had happened. He had $9. The $3.25 from the book fair money had been replenished by a Christmas card from Reverend Whitaker that had contained a $5 bill and a note that said, "We are praying for you both," and by $2 he found in the lining of his winter coat that Miss must have put there and forgotten. He sat at the kitchen table in the Granger house on a Tuesday night with his $9 spread out before him and thought about what they could and could not do. They could not solve the number. He understood that completely. $9 against a number that had grown to the size of a small catastrophe was not arithmetic. That worked in his favor. But he had been watching all these weeks, and he had been thinking, and he had arrived at a conclusion that felt both completely obvious and completely impossible in equal measure. The conclusion was this: the people who could solve the number probably existed. They were probably not far away. They just didn't know the number existed, because no one had told them about it, because the people inside the problem were too close to it to see clearly who could help, and the people outside the problem had no reason to look. Someone needed to connect those two things. He thought about Frances Eliot. He thought about the way she had offered the paper bag, without making it into a performance of charity. He thought about what Miss had said, "She sounds like a good woman," and about how quickly a person could be categorized by a single action taken when it cost him something. He thought about Mr. Arthur, who had not smiled much in 7 months, and who now smiled every Wednesday, and had started telling the nurses about the boy who visited him, and who last week had given Caleb a folded piece of paper with his son's phone number on it, and said, "Tell him I'd like to see him. I don't know if he'll come, but I'd like you to tell him." Caleb had called the number from the Granger house telephone. The son had come the following Sunday. Mr. Arthur had cried, which he had apologized for afterward, and which Caleb had told him was nothing to apologize for. He picked up his $9 and put it back in his pocket. He was not going to spend the $9. He was going to use them differently. The following Saturday, he asked Mrs. Granger if he could use a computer in the family room for a school project. She said yes, and he sat down and spent 2 hours doing research, which was not exactly a school project, but was not exactly not a school project either. He researched 2 things. First, he researched elder care advocacy organizations in the city, specifically ones that handled cases where patients' medical bills had created financial hardship for families without other resources. He found 3 organizations that appeared legitimate, and he wrote down their phone numbers in his homework notebook. Second, he researched a woman named Frances Eliot. He found her because she had a professional profile on a law firm's website. Frances Eliot, the website said, was a senior partner at a firm called Eliot and Marsh, specializing in estate law, elder care legal advocacy, and what the website called institutional accountability, which Caleb looked up and understood to mean, in simplified terms, holding large organizations responsible for doing what they said they would do. He stared at the screen for a long moment. He thought about the paper bag, the peanut butter sandwich, the matter-of-fact way she had offered it, without making him feel small. He wrote down her phone number. Then he sat back and looked at what he had written and thought about what Mista would say if she knew what he was considering. Mista would say, "Baby, what do you have to lose by asking politely?" He thought about that. He thought about the $9 in his pocket, and about Mr. Arthur's son who had come on Sunday, and about the broken vending machine that had taken everyone's dollar and given nothing back, and about the specific injustice of systems that consumed the resources of people with very little and returned nothing. He picked up the phone. He dialed Frances Eliot's office number, which he understood would go to a voicemail, because it was Saturday, and he left a message that he had rehearsed 3 times in his head before dialing. "Hello," he said. "My name is Caleb Monroe. I'm 9 years old. You gave me a peanut butter sandwich in the lobby of Mercy General Hospital in October. My grandmother was sick, and I was waiting, and the vending machine was broken. You might not remember me. I was in the blue sweatshirt with the bleach stain. My grandmother is getting better, but there's a money problem, and I've been doing research, and I think you might be able to help if you wanted to. I'm not asking you to do it for free. I have $9. I know that's not very much, but it's what I have right now, and I want to pay for your help properly, because Miss says you should always pay for someone's time if you have anything at all to pay with. Please call me back at this number if you can. Thank you for the sandwich. It was very good." He hung up. He sat in the family room for a few minutes, feeling the specific lightness of having done the thing you were afraid to do. Then he went back to his room and finished his homework about fractions. Frances Eliot listened to the voicemail on Monday morning, standing in her kitchen drinking her first cup of coffee, and she listened to it twice, and then she sat down at her kitchen table. She remembered the boy. Of course she remembered the boy. She had been thinking about him, intermittently, for 2 months. The serious 9-year-old with the large eyes who had shaken her hand with the formality of someone much older and asked after Gerald with the same genuine concern with which he told her about his grandmother. She had mentioned him to Gerald, who was recovering slowly and with characteristic stubbornness from the cardiac event that had put him in the hospital that evening. Gerald had listened and said, "He sounds like an old soul," which was Gerald's highest category of compliment. She had not expected to hear from the boy. She called the number. Mrs. Granger answered and handed the phone to Caleb, who accepted it with a carefulness that suggested he had not entirely expected his call to be returned. "Mr. Monroe," Frances Eliot said. "This is Frances Eliot. I'm returning your call." There was a pause. "You remember me," Caleb said. "Blue sweatshirt, bleach stain on the left cuff." Frances said, "You shook my hand. You have very good manners." "Miss Dot taught me," Caleb said. "She sounds like a remarkable woman. Tell me about the money problem." He told her. He told her everything, with the organized clarity of someone who had been thinking about how to explain it and had done the thinking thoroughly. The stroke, the rehabilitation facility, the bill, the Social Security income that covered less than a third, the lost dry cleaning job, the apartment that sat empty and continued to accrue rent. He told her about the 3 elder care advocacy organizations he had found and the phone numbers he had written down. He told her about Mr. Arthur and the son who had come on Sunday. When he finished, there was a silence on the line. "You said you have $9, Frances said. "Yes, ma'am." If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. I'm going to tell you something, Caleb, and I want you to listen to it carefully. Frances's voice was even and direct, the voice she used in conference rooms when she was about to say something that would reorganize a room. "I charge $450 an hour. That is what my time costs professionally." A pause. "Your $9 is not going to cover that." "I know," Caleb said. He didn't sound defeated. He sounded like someone who had already processed this and had arrived somewhere past it. "However," Frances continued, "I also do a certain amount of work that I do because it is the right work and because I can afford to do it. I call it," she paused, considering how to phrase it for a 9-year-old, "the work I do because someone once did something kind for me when I didn't expect it, and this is how I pay it forward." A longer pause from Caleb's end. Like what you did with the sandwich, he said slowly. Exactly like that. Oh, Caleb said. And in that single syllable, Frances heard something complex and quiet. Not just relief, but the specific recognition of a child who has understood something true about how the world actually works when it works the way it's supposed to. Keep your $9, Frances said. I'll be in touch with you by the end of the week. Don't mention this to anyone except Miss Dot. Yes, ma'am, Caleb said. Thank you. Thank you for calling, Frances said. It takes courage to ask for help when you're not sure the person will say yes. Miss says it costs nothing to ask politely, Caleb said. Mr. Frances said, is absolutely right. What Frances Eliot discovered when she began looking into Miss Dot's situation was not what she had expected to find. She had expected to find a straightforward medical debt hardship case, sad, common, solvable with the right applications to the right assistance programs, the kind of thing her office handled as a regular matter and which typically resolved within a few weeks of paperwork and phone calls. What she found instead, when she pulled the records and spoke to billing offices and reviewed the detailed accounting of what had happened to Miss Dot's finances over 4 months since the stroke, was something different, something deliberate. Miss had applied through the hospital social services office for a medical hardship assistance program that Mercy General operated for patients who met specific income criteria. Miss Dot met those criteria. Clearly, the application had been filed in October. Shortly after her admission, it had been, according to the records Frances obtained, approved at the initial review level, and then it had been denied at the second review level on grounds that Frances, 30 years into elder care law, did not recognize. The denial cited a regulation that, when Frances looked it up, had been superseded 18 months earlier. It cited a policy that the hospital's own documents showed had been revised. It cited income figures that didn't match Miss Dot's actual Social Security records. Frances made phone calls. She was polite, and then she was precise, and then she was a very particular version of herself that she reserved for situations where she had identified a specific injustice and wanted the people responsible for it to understand that she had. What emerged from those calls was a pattern. Miss Dot's case was not unique. Over the past 2 years, Mercy General's billing department had processed 47 denials of medical hardship applications using the same set of outdated criteria, the same revised policy incorrectly applied, the same systematic errors that resulted in bills being sent to patients who should have been covered, who then either paid amounts they could not afford, lost assets protecting against the debt, or were handed to collections agencies that pursued them with the aggressive efficiency of organizations that understood how to extract money from people who had very little of it. Every single one of the 47 patients was over 60 years old. Every single one was a patient without a family member in a professional position to review the denials carefully. Every single one had, at the point of denial, been in a condition, recovering from illness, managing disability, navigating the specific vulnerability of age and limited income, that made mounting a challenge to the denial practically impossible for them personally. Frances sat at her desk on a Thursday evening looking at the file she had assembled and understood that she was no longer looking at Miss Dot's case. She was looking at something larger and more organized than an administrative error. She picked up the phone and called her partner, David Marsh. I need you to look at something, she said. How big? David asked. 47 cases that we can document, Frances said. Potentially more. A silence. Are we talking about systemic elder financial abuse? I am using those exact words, Frances said. Yes, and your client is a 9-year-old boy with $9 and a hospitalized grandmother, Frances said. There was a longer pause. Frances, I know. You met him in a hospital lobby. He left me a voicemail, Frances said. He told me he wanted to pay for my help properly because his grandmother taught him you should always pay for someone's time if you have anything to pay with. She paused. He's 9, David. I'll clear my Thursday, David Marsh said. The story of the last dollar emerged from Frances's investigation, the way certain details emerge, not centrally, not dramatically, but quietly, as a small fact that became the most important fact once it was fully understood. It came from Miss Dot herself. During a meeting Frances arranged at Sunrise Care in early December, her first meeting with her new client, who sat up very straight in the rehabilitation facility's small conference room and looked at Frances Eliot with the assessing eyes of a woman who had been taken to measure people for 68 years and was not about to stop now. Miss Dot listened to everything Frances presented. She asked 3 precise questions. She was quiet for a long moment after the third answer. "My grandson called you," she said finally. "He left me a very thoughtful voicemail." Frances said, "He said he offered you $9. "He did." Miss Dot looked at her hands for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were very bright. "He had $3.25 from the book fair money when I went into the hospital," she said. "I didn't know he still had it. I thought he would have spent it. He said you gave it to him for the book fair. It was the last money I had until the Social Security check." Miss Dot said, very quietly, "I gave him what was in my purse because I thought I'd be back by noon, and the book fair was that morning, and I didn't want him to be the only child who couldn't buy anything." Her voice was steady. "I was unconscious before noon." Frances was quiet. "He kept it," Miss Dot said, "all these months." "He used part of it to pay for my time," Frances said, symbolically. He was very clear that he understood it wasn't the actual rate. Miss was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What was the first thing he said to you in the hospital?" Frances thought back. He said he was waiting for news about his grandmother. He said it very evenly, like he had practiced not breaking in the middle of it. Miss Dot nodded slowly. Her jaw was working in the careful way of someone who is managing something large internally and intends to manage it completely. "That's my dollar he offered you," she said. "The last one I had. He's been holding on to it for 4 months." "I know," Frances said. They looked at each other across the conference table. "What do you need from me?" Miss Dot asked. "Your story," Frances said. "The complete one. The denial letters, the conversations, every detail you remember. And after that?" Frances Eliot looked at the file on the table between them, at the 47 names behind Miss Dot's name, at the systematic, deliberate, quiet cruelty of a system designed to fail the people it was supposed to help, applied to the most vulnerable patients in the hospital over 2 years, without anyone noticing, because no one inside the problem had the position to see it clearly and no one outside the problem had been given a reason to look. After that, Frances said, "We're going to make a great deal of noise." The courtroom of the Honorable Patricia Weston of the Third Circuit Court was not a large one, but it was a full one on the morning of March the 14th. For months after Frances Eliot had received a voicemail from a 9-year-old boy and started looking carefully at Mercy General Hospital's billing practices. The gallery was filled with journalists, with advocates from elder care organizations, with representatives from the city's Department of Health and Human Services, with several other attorneys who had received calls from Frances in the preceding weeks and had begun their own investigations, and with a row of older men and women, 18 of them, the ones who had been well enough and willing to come, who were the documented victims of the billing scheme Frances had been building her case around. At the defendant's table sat the legal team from Mercy General Hospital, led by a man named William Harcourt, who was expensive and competent, and who had spent the preceding months arguing in pretrial motions that the billing errors were exactly that, errors, not a scheme, not deliberate, not the systematic exploitation of elderly patients that Frances Eliot's filings described them as being. At the plaintiff's table sat Frances Eliot and David Marsh, with files stacked in precise order between them. In the front row of the gallery, wearing a blue sweatshirt, a new one without a bleach stain that Mrs. Granger had bought him for the occasion, sat Caleb Monroe. Beside him sat Miss, who had been discharged from Sunrise Care 6 weeks earlier, whose medical debt had been formally placed in legal hold pending the outcome of these proceedings, and who sat with the particular composed uprightness of a woman who has been through a great deal and has decided not to let it diminish her posture. Miss Dot's cane leaned against the seat beside her. She had Caleb's hand in both of hers. Judge Weston was in her mid-50s, with short gray hair and reading glasses, and the undemonstrative manner of a judge who had seen most of what courts could contain and who maintained her equilibrium by keeping her own responses carefully measured. She had reviewed Frances's filings with the meticulous attention of someone who recognized, early in the process, that the case before her had implications significantly beyond the individual claims. She called the courtroom to order. The legal arguments occupied the morning. Frances presented the systematic billing fraud with the organized clarity of someone who had spent 4 months building a case designed to be impossible to dismantle. The outdated regulations cited in denial letters, the revised policies incorrectly applied, the pattern of 47 cases bearing identical procedural errors, the statistical impossibility of those errors being random, the internal communications between the billing department supervisor, a man named Roland Price, and the hospital's chief financial officer, communications that Frances had obtained through discovery and which described, in language that made the gallery very quiet, a deliberate strategy for redirecting patients who qualified for assistance programs into full payment tracks instead. William Harcourt's team presented their defense with professional competence and a particular energy of people who understood that the communications Frances had obtained were genuinely damaging and were deploying every available counterargument with the focused intensity of that understanding. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Judge Weston called a recess. During the recess, Frances came to where Caleb and Miss Dot were sitting. She sat down beside them. She looked at Caleb. "The judge has indicated that she wants to hear testimony from some of the affected patients," she said. "The older patients. Some of them have been prepared to testify. But she has also indicated—" Frances paused, choosing her words with the care she always brought to speaking with Caleb, "that she would like to hear from you." Caleb looked at her steadily. "Me? The judge has read about you my filings. She has a voicemail transcribed. She knows what you did, the research, the advocacy organizations you identified, the call you made." Frances held his gaze. "She wants to understand, in your own words, how a 9-year-old came to be the person who brought this to attention." "I'm 10 now," Caleb said. He had turned 10 in January. Frances almost smiled. She wanted to understand how a 10-year-old. "I don't have to," Caleb said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't defiant. He was checking. "No, you don't have to." Caleb looked at Miss Dot. Miss Dot looked at him with the face she wore when she was letting him make a decision that was his to make, the face that said she had an opinion, but knew that this was the right moment for him to find his own. He thought about the 47 names in Frances's file. He thought about Mr. Arthur, who had been one of them, whose medical hardship application had been denied on the same fraudulent grounds, whose file was now part of Frances's case with his full and energetically given participation. He thought about the 18 older people in the gallery row, sitting with the careful dignity of people who had survived a quiet and systematic robbery, and were hearsay so on the record. He thought about the last dollar. He thought about what it meant that Miss had given to him from an almost empty purse, because she didn't want him to be the only child who couldn't buy anything at the book fair, and about the fact that he had held on to it for 4 months, not knowing what it was for, and about how it had become something. A voicemail, a case, 47 people sitting in a courtroom being seen. "Okay," he said, "I'll testify." The witness stand in Judge Weston's courtroom was designed for adults. Caleb sat in it with his feet several inches off the floor and his hands folded in his lap in the specific way Miss had taught him, and looked at the judge with the large, serious eyes that had been watching the world carefully since he was very small. Judge Weston looked at him for a moment. "Caleb," she said. Her voice was measured, but it had dropped, slightly, into a register that was not quite the formal register of the preceding hours. "I want to ask you some questions, and I want you to just answer them as simply and honestly as you can. Is that all right with you?" "Yes, ma'am." "How old are you?" 10, ma'am." "Tell me about the day your grandmother went to hospital." He told her. He told her the same way he had told everything he had told over the past months, evenly, carefully, with the precision of someone who had replayed it so many times in his own head that the facts were very clear and very sordid. He told her about the oatmeal on the counter. He told her about the ambulance and the emergency waiting room and the admitting nurse who had asked for an emergency contact. He told her about Nurse Gwen and the orange plastic chairs and the broken vending machine. He told her about Frances Eliot. She gave me a peanut butter sandwich and crackers, he said, because the machine was broken and I hadn't eaten. She didn't make a big deal about it. She just offered it. Judge Weston glanced toward where Frances sat at the plaintiff's table. Frances was looking at the files in front of her. What did you do after your grandmother was moved to the rehabilitation facility? The judge asked. I went to stay with a foster family named the Grangers, Caleb said. They were kind. They gave me my own room and drove me to school. But I could only see Miss Dot on Wednesdays. Did you understand the financial situation your grandmother was in? Caleb was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer this accurately. I didn't know the exact numbers, he said, but I could see how she looked when the subject came up. Miss has a face for things she's worried about, but doesn't want to show me. I know that face. He paused. I've known that face my whole life because there were always things to be worried about, and she always tried to keep them from showing. The courtroom was very quiet. What made you decide to try to help? Judge Weston asked. I had $9, Caleb said, and I knew that wasn't going to fix anything by itself. But Miss always says it costs nothing to ask politely. So I thought if I could find the right person to ask, maybe the $9 didn't have to fix it alone. Maybe it just had to start something. And you chose Ms. Eliot. I look her up, Caleb said. After she gave me the sandwich, I wrote down her name because she was kind in a specific way. Not like she was performing kindness, just like she was doing something reasonable. And when I looked her up and found out she was an elder care lawyer, I thought that was probably not a coincidence. I thought maybe the same thing that made her give me the sandwich was the same thing that made her choose that kind of law. Frances looked up from her files. She looked at Caleb for a moment. Then she looked back down. Tell me about the $9. The judge said. Where did they come from? Some of it was book fair money Miss Dot gave me the morning she got sick, Caleb said. She gave me everything she had in her purse because she didn't want me to be the only one at school who couldn't buy anything. He was quiet for a moment. I found out later that was her last money until her Social Security check. The courtroom was very quiet now. Even William Harcourt's team had gone still. She gave me her last dollar, Caleb said. And then he said it again, because the judge was watching him with an expression he wanted to respond to fully. She gave me her last dollar, so I wouldn't be left out, and I kept it. I kept all of it, because it felt like something I was supposed to hold on to until I understood what for. Judge Weston looked at him. There were other people in the room looking at him too, the 18 elderly patients in the gallery row, some of whom were no longer managing their expressions with the same careful control they had been managing them with all morning. And when you did understand what was for, the judge asked. I used it to pay Ms. Eliot, Caleb said. I know it wasn't enough to actually cover anything. But Miss Dot taught me you always pay for someone's help if you have anything to pay with. It was what I had. I wanted to pay with what I had. He looked at the judge directly. Miss Eliot found out it wasn't just Miss Dot, he said. There are 47 people. They all got denied the same way. They all got bills they shouldn't have gotten. They all had the same thing happen to them, and none of them had anyone to ask. He paused. I had Miss Eliot. They needed to have her, too. Judge Weston was quiet for a moment. Is there anything else you'd like to say, Caleb? He thought about it. He thought about Miss Dot's hand in the front row, and Mr. Arthur, who visited with his son every Sunday now, and the 18 people in the gallery row who had come to sit in a courtroom and be counted. I want to say something to the people in the gallery, he said. Judge Weston looked at him. Then she said, Go ahead. Caleb turned in the witness chair to face the gallery. He looked at the row of older people, some of them using canes, some of them in wheelchairs, some of them simply sitting in the careful, upright way of people who have decided that what they do here today is going to be done properly. I don't think any of you knew that other people had the same thing happen to you, he said. I think they counted on that. I think they knew that if you all found out it was the same thing happening to all of you, you'd be harder to deal with than if you were each alone with your own problem. He paused. Miss Dot taught me that the difference between a problem and a solvable problem is usually whether you're trying to solve alone or together. I'm sorry it took so long for someone to come tell you that you weren't alone. The courtroom remained in its particular silence for a moment after he finished speaking. Then one of the women in the gallery row, a 71-year-old named Miriam Okafor, who had been denied hardship assistance after a hip replacement and who had spent 18 months repaying a bill that she should never have received, began to applaud. She applauded alone for approximately 3 seconds. Then she was not applauding alone. Judge Weston let it go for a moment longer than she might have under other circumstances. Then she raised her gavel. "Order," she said. But her voice, Frances noted from the plaintiff's table, was not quite as flat as it had been all morning. Judge Patricia Weston's ruling, delivered 6 weeks after the hearing, was 42 pages long. The summary was simple. Mercy General Hospital had engaged in a systematic practice of wrongful denial of medical hardship assistance to elderly patients who met the program's eligibility criteria. The pattern was documented, deliberate, and had persisted for at least 2 years. It had caused documented financial harm to 47 identified patients, with evidence suggesting the actual number was higher. Roland Price, the billing department supervisor, had directed the practice with the knowledge and implicit authorization of the hospital's chief financial officer, Marcus Dern, who had been aware of the denial strategy and had not intervened. The ruling ordered full reimbursement to all 47 documented plaintiffs, plus interest, plus a penalty for each wrongful denial calculated according to the state's elder financial abuse statute, which provided for treble damages when systematic exploitation of elderly patients was proven. The hospital was further ordered to submit to an independent audit of all hardship denials for the preceding 5 years, to identify any additional affected patients, and to reimburse them under the same terms. Roland Price was referred to the State Attorney General's office for criminal investigation. Marcus Dern was similarly referred. The hospital was required to establish an independent patient advocacy office with authority to review all hardship denials, staffed with advocates who reported not to hospital administration, but to an independent board, funded by the hospital at a level specified in the ruling. Ms. Dott's specific debt, the one that started everything, was addressed in the ruling with the specificity that Frances had requested and the judge had granted. Full cancellation, full reimbursement of the amounts Miss had paid, and a formal acknowledgement in the record that her denial had been wrongful. The total financial remedy across all 47 plaintiffs, plus penalties, plus the cost of the audit and the new advocacy office, was a number that made the front page of the city newspaper. The story beneath the number mentioned a 10-year-old boy and a last dollar. It mentioned them briefly, because Caleb had asked Frances specifically to keep his name as small as possible, because Mista would be embarrassed if he made a spectacle of things, and because the 47 people were the story, not him. Frances had done her best. The newspaper had done its own. On the Saturday after the ruling, Caleb sat at the kitchen table in Miss Dott's apartment. Their apartment, the one they were backing together now, the one with the plants on the windowsill that Mrs. Kim from the dry cleaning shop had watered all the months they were gone, and he spread the $9 out on the table. Mr. sat across from him with 2 cups of tea and watched him. "You know what I want to do with this," he said. "What?" "I want to go to the book fair. There's one at school next week." He looked up. The real one this time. Miss Dot looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Baby, that is exactly right." He folded the bills carefully. He picked up the coins and put them in his sweatshirt pocket, where they clinked together with a small sound. "There's something else," he said. "Tell me." "Mr. Arthur." Caleb had been thinking about this for weeks. He needs someone to visit him more than once a week. His son comes Sunday, but that's still a lot of days without anyone. Miss sipped her tea, and there are other people like him. At Sunrise Care, at Mercy General, places like that. People without visitors. He looked at his hands. I was thinking about a program. Not a big thing. Just kids from school going on Saturdays to visit, to play chess or talk, or just sit. Something like what I did. Miss was quiet. Frances says she knows people at some foundations who fund things like that, Caleb said. She said she'd help me write a proposal. She said the hardest part is the first one, and that the second and third come easier once you've done the first. Miss set down her tea. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the dry, warm, familiar hand that was the first and most consistent thing he had ever known. You are going to do things, she said. Do you understand that? Real things. Things that matter. I know, Caleb said. You've already done them. I know, he said again. But I want to do more. Miss squeezed his hand. Her eyes were bright in the specific way they got when she was proud of something and was not going to cry about it because she had decided not to. Then do more, she said, but eat breakfast first. It is worth saying something at the end of this about what it means that the courtroom went silent. Not the kind of silent that means shock or discomfort or a performed hush of a room waiting to react. The kind of silent that means something true has been said, and the room needs a moment to accommodate the weight of it. Caleb Monroe stood in a witness box designed for adults and told a courtroom full of lawyers and journalists and frightened elderly people, and a judge who had seen most of what courts could contain his grandmother had given him her last dollar, so he wouldn't be left out, and that he'd kept it for 4 months because it felt like something he was supposed to hold on to until he understood what it was for. The courtroom went silent because it had understood all at once what that dollar was. Not $9, $1, given last, given from hands that had nothing left beyond it, given for specific reason that a child should not feel excluded, should not go without, should have something to hold in his hand when the other children had things to hold in theirs. It was a dollar that started everything. It was a dollar that became a voicemail and became a case, and became 47 names on a legal filing, and became a ruling that changed the hospital's practices and returned money to people from whom it had been quietly and deliberately taken. $1, given last, without knowing what would start, given purely because the person giving it loved the person receiving it and wanted the world to be, just for that morning, a little less hard. Mista did not know, when she pressed that last dollar into Caleb's hand in their kitchen, while the oatmeal was still on the stove, that she was putting into motion a chain of events she could not see. She was just being missed at giving what she had, without calculation, without knowing what it would return, because that was what you did when you loved someone and you had anything at all to give. This is what the courtroom understood, sitting in the silence after a 10-year-old boy said simply, "She gave me her last dollar." It understood that the most powerful forces in the world are not the ones that come with legal teams and billing department strategies and internal communications directing the exploitation of people who cannot fight back. The most powerful forces are the ones that begin in a kitchen on an ordinary morning, in the last dollar in a woman's purse, given freely, with love, to a boy who held on to it until he understood what it was for, and then used it to pay for help, and then made sure the help went to everyone who needed it. Not just himself. Everyone. 3 years after the ruling, the Clement Street Youth Visiting Program operated in 11 elder care facilities across the city. Every Saturday, groups of children between the ages of 8 and 15 arrived at those facilities with chessboards and card games, and sometimes nothing at all, just time and attention, and the willingness to sit beside a person who had been forgotten and say, without saying it, that they had been seen. The program had been started by a 10-year-old boy with a proposal he had written with Frances Eliot's help, funded initially by a small grant from Foundation Frances had connected him with, and which had grown, the way things grown from genuine need tend to grow, organically, by being something that was clearly necessary and clearly working. Caleb was 13 now. He ran the program with the organizational seriousness of someone who had understood from the beginning that good intentions without structure were just good intentions, and that the people the program served deserved something more reliable than good intentions. He was in the 8th grade. He was in the top 3 of his class. He had recently told Frances that he was thinking about law, which he had received with the contained satisfaction of someone who predicted this, and was not surprised and was very glad. He visited Mr. Arthur every Saturday. Mr. Arthur's son came every Sunday. Mr. Arthur had his model trains now. His son had retrieved them from the garage. They were on a shelf by the window, in the room with the view of the garden that someone had started maintaining again. Mr. Arthur could tell you the name and model number and running history of every single one of them, and he did every Saturday, and Caleb listened to every word. On the shelf beside the trains was a framed photograph that Mr. Arthur had asked Caleb permission to print and frame. It was a photograph taken outside the courthouse on the day of the ruling. Frances Eliot and Miss Dot and Caleb and Mr. Arthur and 16 other plaintiffs, standing in the March sunlight with a particular quality of people who have done something together and know it and are still slightly surprised by themselves. Caleb was in the center of the photograph. He was wearing the new blue sweatshirt without the bleach stain, the one Mrs. Granger had bought him for the trial. He was standing straight, with his hands at his sides, looking at the camera with the large, serious eyes that had been watching the world carefully since he was very small. Miss Dot was beside him, her hand on his shoulder, looking not at the camera, but at him. Her expression in the photograph was not pride. Exactly. Pride was a simpler thing. It was something more complete than that. The expression of a woman looking at the person she had raised and seeing clearly and fully that the person she had raised was exactly who she had been trying to raise, and that this had not happened by accident, but by the slow, patient work of every morning breakfast, and every night's homework, and every dollar given when you had no dollars left, and every lesson taught by example rather than instruction, every lesson about how to be in the world, about watching carefully, about asking politely, about paying what you have, even when what you have is small, because it is yours to give and the giving is what matters, about not waiting for someone else to notice what you have noticed, about understanding that the difference between a problem and a solvable problem is usually whether you're trying to solve alone or together, about giving your last dollar without knowing what it will start. The photograph sat on Mr. Arthur's shelf beside his trains, and the garden outside his window was maintained now. And the Saturday visits continued, and the program kept growing. And somewhere in a kitchen on Clement Street, on Saturday mornings before Caleb went out, Miss Dot made oatmeal. And the oatmeal was always finished before anyone left the table. And the dollar, not the physical dollar, which had been spent at a school book fair and biography of Thurgood Marshall that Caleb had read 4 times. But the thing the dollar had been, the last given thing, the freely offered thing, the love-made material in the only form available, that continued. It continued in the way that things continue when they have been set in motion by someone who did not count the cost before giving, the way a river continues, the way kindness continues, when someone receives it and understands that receiving creates a debt, not to the giver, but to everyone else who has not yet received it. She gave me her last dollar. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. And he held on to it until he understood what it was for, and then he used it to start everything.